Değerli misafirler, bir kez daha hoş geldiniz. 10. Türkiye Enerji Zirvesi'nin ikinci günün artık son oturumundayız. Moderatörümüz ve konuşmacılarımız yerlerini aldılar. Ben yine de kendilerini sizlere tanıtacağım. Bu oturumumuzun adı Küresel LNG piyasalarında trendler ve Türkiye için LNG'de gelecek stratejileri. Moderatörümüz Forbes Finans ve Enerji Direktörü Gaurav Sharma ve konuşmacılarımız da yine sırasıyla sizlere tanıtacağım. Enerji Strat Direktörü Ashutosh Shastri ve S&P Global Platts Avrupa ve Atlantik Bölgesi LNG Editörü Desmond Fong. Buyurunuz.
Good afternoon, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. We are in the concluding session of the second day of the 10th Turkey Energy Summit. And I think it's been a very natural gas and LNG specific day. We've had lots of interesting dialogues. And I think to bring things to a close, at least in Hall 1, we'll sort of round things up and look at some of the trends. So the topic at hand for this session is trends in global LNG markets, and of course what we can extrapolate from there and the future strategies for Turkey in LNG. My name is Gaurav Sharma. I'm an analyst, an independent analyst, and I write for Forbes, Rigzone, and provide analysis to various other publications. And to discuss this crucial topic, we've got two eminent spokespeople. You might have heard them earlier in the day. I'd like you to introduce you to Ashutosh Shastri, who is the director of Enerstat Consulting. And joining Ashutosh is Desmond Wong, who is the managing editor at S&P Global Platts, and he covers the European and Atlantic Basin LNG products. So without much further ado, we apologize for a little bit of a delay. We had some sound issues, but we're now going to get going. And may I invite Desmond to first make his presentation, followed by which Ashutosh will make a short presentation. Thank you.
Right, so I do see some familiar faces in the crowd today. But same statement as I would for any one of these things. Please, all of the data that we present are for the purposes of analysis primarily. Do not make any investment decisions based on our information. Right. So let me just see if that works. Okay. So actually, before I do this, you've already seen the first slide, so the surprise is gone. But who do you think has been the largest supplier of LNG into not the Mediterranean, but Northwest Europe over the past year or so? Anyone willing to take a guess? No, Australia's a bit too far away. US would be for the Med. You're almost there. One more person left. Who has been really supplying a lot of the LNG into Northwest Europe lately? It's Russia. Now, I'll get to that in a second, but first, let me just give you a flavor of what's been happening in the Atlantic Basin and the Mediterranean over the past few years, right? As we all know, LNG back in the day has been largely a fuel that Europe doesn't necessarily need as much, with the exception of Spain, right? Traditionally, their volumes have always been a lot higher because they have the Pyrenees, and that's kept them from building pipelines as a connection to the rest of Europe. So they get their gas from Algeria and LNG. However, over the past couple of years, you'll notice that many of the major importers in Western Europe, and specifically Spain in this case in the Mediterranean, have far exceeded the amount of volume that they purchase or they have received in terms of cargoes over the past couple of years. If you look at, and one of the important things that to take a note of is, if you look at Spain, we're not done with the year yet, right? They're very likely going to exceed last year's full numbers because we're only in October. Still a couple of more months to go. We're still in Q4, right? France, significant increase. The Netherlands, more than doubling. Belgium, more than tripling. And the UK, at least a third higher for the year to date. We're not even talking about the winter yet in terms of receiving these cargoes. And where are they coming from? As you can tell, it's no surprise that Qatar, of course, is supplying a lot of the additional volume into the Mediterranean and Northwest Europe. Of course, Qatari volumes, a lot of them arriving into the South Hook terminal in the UK, a lot of them arriving in Italy, a lot of them arriving in Turkey and other portions of the Mediterranean. But the real surprise gainers have been Russia and the US. For the US, a lot of this has been led by the rise of the new projects, right? This year we saw the commissioning of Freeport, Cameron, right? And the previous years we've seen other projects come online. Sabine Pass has been around for a while, but you're also looking at Corpus Christi, Dominion, Cove Point as well. There's a lot of US volume and it needs a place to go. And the reason is very obvious, but I'll show the numbers later on, but also the surprise increase in Russian volume, right? The Russian material, in terms of LNG, not gas, has nowhere else to go in the Atlantic basin. Asia is too far. The ice covers the Arctic for most of the year. And for most of 2019, they were supposed to have a reload point for redistribution in Zeebrugge, but that tank is not finished yet. So all those cargoes have to go somewhere, and they come to Europe. As we all know, there's no such thing as LNG floating contango, right? Every molecule has to be delivered by a certain time, otherwise the boil-off it's going to be a pain in the butt. And at the same time, you're also seeing that shipping rates are pretty expensive, but I'll get to that later. So what has this done to how Europe has begun to balance all of this LNG? We know Asian demand is a lot lower. Asian supply is a lot higher with Australia, Ichthys, all of the new projects in Asia, and the US projects as well. So this is an example of how much, and let's put it this way, if you look at the beginning of that, graph, right, in 2018, that's send out during January. That's winter, right, where people generally need to consume natural gas for heating and power generation. In the span of only a year, those winter peaks in Europe, where you expect demand to be highest, have been far exceeded by the send-out of the cargoes that have to find a home. Hello? Oh, there we go. Have to find a home in the Atlantic basin, and they are showing up in Europe. And as a result, those tanks are not infinite, right? And European onshore storage, meaning your storage in Germany, your storage in the UK, which has been significantly reduced since the loss of Rough, a lot of that storage capability in Europe for pure gas, not LNG, has been used up because they couldn't use it up from the previous winter. Everything ends up in the LNG terminals, and the send-out has to be cleared. They can't stay in the tanks forever. So send-out, even in non-winter periods, for this year, the highest period we've seen has been in May, right, the spring. And that's when nobody needs natural gas, anywhere in the Mediterranean, anywhere in Northwest Europe. It's just not cold. But the send-out was incredibly high because all of those projects needed to deliver their cargoes to a place that could be regasified. And let's take a look at storage at the same time, right? So if you look at the beginning of that graph, you're looking at storage in the LNG terminals across Europe at the beginning of winter, largely being very full. That's no surprise. People keep volume in tank in Europe for any of the cold spells that may arrive. We've had a couple of polar vortex cold snaps in Northwest Europe as well. So keeping cargoes in tank in the winter is not unusual. But let's look at 2019, right? First of all, the amount of stuff that was arriving did not really clear out towards over the summer of 2018. And when you hit the beginning of 2019, a lot of that volume is still in tank because the amount of cargoes arriving in Northwest Europe far exceeded the ability of the market to actually absorb it. So what you end up with is TTF gas prices, NBP gas prices going down, 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 down. The tanks constantly receiving cargoes from people who need to optimize their volume. That's how much spare LNG is arriving in Northwest Europe and the Mediterranean. And why is that? Well, the JKM itself, right, which is the Platts measure, is the Platts benchmark for delivered LNG prices in the Asia Pacific, has not been particularly strong over the past couple of years simply because demand has faded off in the Asia Pacific. It's been 2 fairly mild winters. It's been 2 summers that haven't been particularly hot. So for every time you don't use up the LNG that you're contracted to receive, you end up with surplus for the next peak cycle. So you buy less spot. As a result, demand for cargoes in the Asia Pacific is low, supported by the fact that you've got a lot of new production, And the Atlantic Basin is also seeing significant amounts of new production because the US cargoes will deliver both into the Atlantic and in Asia. And as we all know, the amount of cargoes being produced by the US at full tilt, even up until this point, is pretty much a second Qatar in the market that can go in two directions. 21 days to Asia, 10 days to Europe. So prices for that, for JKM itself, have come off. Prices for the Mediterranean and prices for Northwest Europe, because I'm using our Platts Northwest European LNG market for that, delivered prices into Northwest Europe for LNG, not gas, and the Mediterranean market, which we use to measure delivered LNG prices into the Med. All of those have come off as supply continues to flow into both markets, which don't really need them and don't have the capacity to store it. And here's another way to look at it, right? So most people like to think that LNG can be measured in Europe by looking at the TTF price, right? TTF is the same thing as gas. Gas is the same price as LNG, but no. If you compare the spread of our assessed Northwest European prices and our Mediterranean prices versus TTF, you'll notice that almost all the time over the past, from the summer all the way until now, at the beginning of October, all of those prices have been invariably at a discount to TTF, even in Spain, for example, and other parts of the Mediterranean. Can anyone tell me why that might be the case? No. Well, here's what happened, right? With all of this supply and all of the terminal availability in Europe, you can't convince a buyer in Spain, you can't convince a buyer in Greece, you can't convince a buyer in France or the Netherlands to take LNG any cheaper than your hub, at the same price as your hub. Because if you are buying gas and you need to balance your portfolio, just go to the hub. It's a lot easier, right? Why would you pay above the hub to balance your portfolio? If someone wants to convince you to buy LNG and you have capacity at an LNG terminal, you have to offer it to the guy at below hub to cover not just his logistics, but his margin. Otherwise, he's just going to go buy TTF, right, or sell TTF. Why does he need to go to the LNG market? So in order for all of this extra material to get absorbed into Europe, the prices of delivered LNG in Europe have had to be below hub prices, right? Sometimes as far as 20 cents per MMBTU below hub price, sometimes at a small premium because for that period there was a bit of a summer temperature spike and PVB, the Spanish gas hub price, was quite expensive, so some of the Med prices did peak above TTF for a while. But other than that, why would anybody pay above hub for your gas? And here's another factor about why the global situation is quite long for LNG. Another way to look at it is this. So if you look on the left side, right, in terms of the axis on the left, right, that is your JKM versus Mediterranean pricing for LNG. So LNG versus LNG, and that tan area is how wide the spread is between those two markets, right? So for as far as the past year has been, from January 2018 all the way until now, the gap between the most expensive LNG market in Europe, which is the Mediterranean, versus Asia-Pacific pricing has not exceeded $2, right? At the same time, if you look at the cost of shipping between the US and Europe and the US to Asia, the spread between the US to Asia pricing has always been higher than, it's always been more expensive than that $2 mark, more or less, broadly speaking. Which means if you're a US producer, right, if you're Cheniere, Total, Shell, any one of those people with huge amounts of capacity in the US, and you make a choice, and you say, where do I send my spot LNG that's not in my contract? You're not going to pick Asia because the cost to get there by boat in this low price market is too high for you to make a margin. So where do you go? It's only 10 days to Europe. You can make 2 trips to Europe for a much smaller margin than to go to Asia to get one trip for a big margin, right? Because 10 days versus 21 days. So in terms of shipping rate, shipping cost versus the spread between the Mediterranean and Asia, it's a no-brainer to choose the deliveries into the Mediterranean. Also, for a US guy, if you deliver into Europe, you have a choice. The distance from the Gulf Coast of Mexico is a straight 2 split, one into the Med, one into Northwest Europe. The shipping cost for you is the same, so you can target all the availability in the Netherlands, France, and the UK, or you can go for Spain, Greece, Turkey. It doesn't matter because the shipping distance is about the same for you. No other producers can do that. So if you're Nigerian, if you're producing Nigerian supply, Norwegian, there's always something that is closer to you that's a lot easier. For the US, it's only a choice between Europe and Asia. And of course, I've talked about the US stuff a lot. That is your situation in terms of, I hate to use the word oversupply, but I've resisted using it for many years, but I think we're at this point when I can say oversupply. Because with the Australian projects coming on, in the next couple of years, you're going to see all of those trains from the US begin to ramp up, right? The fastest rate of gain, if the projects start on time, is approximately in 2020, right? That's your steepest increase in production, where you're looking at almost a third more, no, not even that. It's close to double the amount of stuff that we already have seen being produced from the US come out into the Atlantic basin with optionality to deliver into the Asia Pacific or Europe. And that's a big issue for both regions, because Asian growth, I don't think, is growing at that pace. And European demand is largely driven these days now by how cheap you can get the LNG to convince a buyer to purchase your cargo. As I mentioned before, cargoes have to be sold these days at below hub unless you have a long-term contract position that you can optimize into, for example, right? So there's a lot more supply coming Europe's way, or the Atlantic basin's way. And that's kind of the situation for the physical cargo side, right? LNG also has a pretty big derivatives market, known as the JKM derivative, but not very inventive with paper product titles in the sector. But what you're looking at here is an over-the-counter product that is cleared through ICME or brokers, right? And it's the paper market that people use to hedge their JKM cargoes. And if you look at liquidity growth, since about 2016 to 2017, that's when it began to increase very, very, very quickly. That also matches the time period where people's exposure to JKM began to get a lot higher, because that was when a lot of the new projects in Australia began coming out, and there was a lot more risk that you needed to hedge. So, like most paper markets, the JKM derivative initially was thought to not really be going anywhere. And this is where, but that was like a long time ago, right? It's taken us a couple of years to get there. This is what the curve, the forward curve, looks like for the JKM paper market in August 2018, right? So we're just comparing end of summer to end of summer, right? I've highlighted all of the prompt contracts, right? So your month ahead contracts, your month +2, your month +3 contracts in red. So those are your prompt, very near-term contracts, usually the most liquid on any kind of derivative product for energy, right? And that is the proportion versus the dark blue, which I have colored, and those are your down-the-curve contracts, your calendar year contracts, your gas year contracts, your quarterly contracts, your seasonal contracts, much further down the curve. So as of 2018, August, the JKM derivatives curve could actually be actively traded out all the way till Cal 20, but not a lot of volume there. More than half. Half is more or less where the forward curve is, and the other half is where the prompt is. Now let me show you how that's evolved by 2019, in the span of a very, very short period of time. You're looking at a lot more, so if you look at the types of contracts that are being done, right, the variety and the sophistication on the other side, in 2018, look at how many more different types of forward contracts that the market is more than happy to trade and to hedge against in the paper market for JKM, in the paper market for LNG. The forward curve, in a year, you can now go as far as, you've got Cal 21, but a lot more Cal 21, a lot more Cal 20. The prompt activity is also still quite high, but you're looking at more than, in terms of proportion, a lot more of forward contract trading further ahead than you do for the near term. And the sophistication has increased. So as a paper market to hedge LNG cargoes into the Asia Pacific, the market itself has developed in terms of derivatives to a point where you could easily, and let me just give you, these are a few quick facts on what the contract shape looks like. You can easily clear 4 cargoes in a day. In fact, for the month of July, which was the highest month on record so far, July 2019, 161 cargoes worth of LNG was hedged on the JKM derivative market. Which means when people always complain, oh, the paper market's not liquid enough, I can't hedge, which happens to a lot of emerging markets, LNG has passed that stage. And if you look at the total amount of LNG traded, of JKM derivatives traded per year, it's about 2/3 of the total global short-term trade, which means to us that usually when it exceeds your total physical volume, then you end up with a lot of speculative transactions, right? But it's not anywhere near exceeding physical short-term trade, which indicates to us that a lot of the JKM derivatives activity is hedging, which means people are using it against physical cargoes. Not a lot of speculation. The market participants in this field as well are quite diverse. So you've got all of the physical guys, you've got all the financial guys who have exposure to physical, but as the market begins to grow slowly but surely, we're also seeing liquidity being provided by slightly more speculative players, because JKM invariably also has to take a certain amount of reference from European gas markets, right? One market in Asia, one market in Europe. That's where the cargoes have to go. As NBP and TTF become more volatile over the years and become more active and more liquid, we've also seen a few speculative counterparties, a few hedge funds actually beginning to participate in the JKM swaps market. But they don't buy big tranches. They're not going to buy 300 lots to hedge one cargo. They have no physical exposure. They'll buy one lot here, 5 lots there, that kind of thing, for their own position. But it all helps. Every market participant adds to liquidity, adds to market making. All right? So that's where the paper market for LNG at this point is at. But with all of this happening, a lot of people sort of ask us, how do you calculate JKM, right? How real is that number? And here's how we solve that problem, right? You've seen, you may have heard of Platts assessment methods in other commodities, fuel oil, for example, dated Brent, that kind of thing, the window process. So we've instituted what we like to call the market on close process for both Asia and the Atlantic Basin. What this is a process in which market participants submit firm, transactable bids and offers to prove value to us so that so the market can contest the value of JKM. What I mean by that is, if you take a look at this, this is the growth of active bids and offers within the Platts MOC process for the Asia Pacific, right? We went electronic about 2 months ago, maybe 3, depending on how you look at it. I keep forgetting it's October already. But the number of bids and offers, as well as trades that happen within our process, submitted by companies to prove the price of JKM, has increased since it started in June in 2018. And insofar as how we measure it, not all of the cargoes that get put into our MOC process for Asia have to just be for Asia, right? As we all know, cargoes can be bid or offered on only Japan delivery basis, only China delivery basis, right? So we have a broad spread of people trying to prove value within the Platts process. So not only do we have JKTC bids and offers, so stuff for Japan, Korea, Taiwan, China, But people are also more than happy to use our process to prove value for India, Dubai, and Kuwait. So you can see some of those in the purple pie, right? Some India prices, some IDK prices, that's the percentage of the ones that end up in our system. Because our system is designed to accurately test value within a market. And market participants are more than happy to use that system, submit those prices to us so that our assessment of JKM is as correct and as accurate as possible. And these are the market participants that are in the Asia-Pacific JKM, MOC process. So these are the people who voluntarily submit firm bids and offers and even trade indications or trade directly through the MOC process with us, so that they can contest value for JKM. And it's with the help of these market participants that JKM is that accurate pricing point for the Asia Pacific. But I also said that to track all of the prices that are happening, Asia is not the only place where there's growing liquidity, right? We started the Atlantic Basin MOC for the Mediterranean, as well as Northwest Europe. And we've gotten, and it's still in its very beginning phases. So you're seeing bids and offers for the Mediterranean, and that's one proportion of it. Northwest Europe, someone put in a bid and offer for a Dominican Republic cargo. That was a bit strange to prove value for Europe. But also US FOB cargoes get expressed in terms of us assessing either US cargo prices or us assessing Mediterranean and Northwest European prices. So the same process is happening in Europe so that we can also accurately assess the delivered price of landed cargoes in Europe. Because remember earlier I said that gas hub prices are not an accurate reflection of LNG delivered into Europe. It's always at a differential to hub. And this helps us make sure that our assessments for that are rock solid. It's still in its early phases, of course, but we have already gotten quite a few participants joining up with in the Atlantic Basin, people who are willing to contest the pricing of cargoes in the Mediterranean, in Northwest Europe, as well as US volume. So that's kind of where we stand in terms of pricing and the fundamentals in the LNG market. To sum it all up, really, Europe has become a balancing point of cargoes because of all of the additional supply. It can't go to Asia, it has to come to Europe because only Europe has the clear pricing to take it, and only Europe has all of the capacity to absorb it. But that has had several effects, right? It drives down European pricing, it drives down the price of LNG in the region, making it more accessible to other markets in the region. And the net result of this is that this situation might continue to last for at least a couple of years longer when we expect the US projects to begin producing at the highest steep of production gain over 2020. And that's pretty much it from our side.
Sure. We'll take the question and answers towards the end.
Sure.
Perhaps you take a seat and then Ashutosh can begin his. What is your preference? Would you like to take the lectern or would you like to be comfortable as you are? You can.
No, I think I'll take a lectern so that at least
Fair enough.
You know, I don't have a detailed presentation, but I'll try and complement what Desmond has just said. I want to just carrying a few cheat sheet notes.
You'll have a double.
Is that right?
Just be a switch off. Otherwise, your thingy will echo.
Right.
There you go.
Okay. Okay. So good afternoon, everyone. This is really the very last dead-end shift, very last presentation of this 10th Congress. I would like to kind of be a little bit more expansive and less data-oriented, if I may, in this presentation, and really talk a little bit about the key global trends in LNG. What are the macro trends, global trends that we see? There has been a very detailed presentation by Desmond on how Europe, the role that Europe is playing in terms of its global pricing. The question a lot of our own clients ask in the emerging markets is the LNG market going to look like the oil market? And the answer is a little bit, but not really totally like that. So let me kind of expand. First of all, despite the current so-called glut in the LNG market, the LNG market is expected to double between now and 2030. So which means that you have, the total size of the LNG market today is about 316 as per the IGU end of 2018 million tons per annum. And that is going to about 600 at a minimum by 2030. Now, what is more interesting in those 316 and the 600 numbers is what is the nature of the long-term contracts. Traditionally, LNG has been a long-term contract business. LNG buyers and sellers have always referred to each other as their development partners, or they have never really, although there is a gas sales and purchase agreement, it has always been partners and participants in the chain, and the chain has always been an integrated chain. That chain is now breaking out, and we see a number of business models, a number of specialists coming in. The portfolio LNG players are coming in, the traders are coming in, shipping is becoming an industry in its own right. But what is even more interesting is around the pricing side of things, that about 1/3 of the LNG market today, which is around 100 million tons per annum, is contracted on a non-long-term basis. And I really use the phrase non-long-term because I really don't want to get into a discussion about what is long-term, what is non-long-term, what is short-term, what is spot LNG, all of that. But essentially LNG that is not contracted out for more than 20 years, which used to be the case. Typical LNG contracts used to be 20-year contracts with 5-year price reopener clauses. The reopener clauses where there was a set of conditions that were established and they were articulated in the contract as to when such an event would happen. That would be when the price reopener would be triggered. So there used to be fairly detailed, long-term, risk-orientated contracts. Now these contracts tend to be a lot more towards the 5 to 10-year period or even less than 10-year period. The other trend that we are now seeing is that earlier there was a lot of variation within the LNG contract terms. And what we are now seeing is a standardization of a LNG contract, a standard LNG contract. What does the standard LNG contract do? The standard LNG contract tries to harmonize LNG for the slight variations in the gas quality, the cetane number within LNG and all of that. So there is now a harmonization, which means the technology is available for harmonizing or kind of harmonizing gas quality, which means the services that the regasification terminal would now provide you would not just be just a regasification service, but a quality matching service, and therefore a different price for quality matching, different price for the regasification services. So again, getting a little bit more sophisticated. So this non-long-term contract market is about 100 million tons per annum today, and that is going to go to about 250 to 275 million tons per annum, which means almost the size of the global LNG market today is going to be the size of the non-long-term contracts. And this is going to change what I call the strategic the conduct in this business. The structure of the industry has changed, therefore the conduct to a certain extent must follow, and therefore we will see a LNG industry which will be characterized by certain winners and losers. And who are the likely winners in this case? Let's take a slightly expansive view about what are the other trends that are happening in the industry which the LNG business is actually exploring or embracing. One of them is big data and analytics as to what have been the typical trade flows so far, what can we learn from the so far trade flows. As more and more non-long-term LNG gets contracted, a floating ship carrying LNG is a floating asset, a floating storage. And once you start to look at that, you begin to see that, for example, you can imagine a scenario where a spot LNG contract is required to match, a very unexpected turn in the weather. The company in question is not going to open an open tender, which is what we see today, but it is more likely to kind of say, what is the delivery window we are looking at, and within the delivery window, what are the where do we see the ships that are carrying LNG, and which of those ships actually have some uncontracted or spot LNG, which of them can actually switch the direction. So it is going to be quite intelligence driven, quite a very specialized focus driven scenario. Now this is not something that is happening now, but this is exactly what the suppliers of LNG are now talking about when they say that this is what we will now offer flexibility in the contract to our buyers. So the buyer-supplier relationship is changing. So this is the first point I would like to make. The second point I would like to make is that around small-scale LNG. And small-scale LNG and bunkering is going to be bunkering rather is going to be an instrument that will create the small-scale LNG. While we see, inexorably there is a shift towards the center of gravity for LNG trade is moving eastwards, most commentary so far is around India and China. The Indian market in the last 3-4 years has actually not delivered to that promise, because not that because something fundamentally has gone wrong, but there has been a time shift. But what is actually missing in action here is the aggregated demand of non-India, non-China, Asian demand, which is going to be equally substantial. So what you will now see is new players coming in onto the LNG, in the LNG industry. New smaller regions, smaller countries will now emerge as buyers of LNG, and therefore you will see new actors. These new actors are likely to be in Africa, in Latin America, and what we then will see is that we do not know how this trend will now develop, whether these new buyers in Africa and Latin America would prefer to have a traditional LNG model in order to manage their risk because they're new to the LNG business, or whether they would show the gumption to say, we will skip a generation, we will actually embrace the short-term LNG trade, and therefore we will be able to optimize our weighted average cost of gas procurement. So how these buyers will actually now think about the liquid nature of a globalizing LNG market is going to be a very interesting development. And I think the whole discussion around Turkey has to be kind of structured around some of these dimensions. Very quickly, I will run through some of the other things, which is around a quick point around economics. Along with smaller countries and smaller regions, we are also seeing an emergence of different supply sources coming through. And as a result of the efficiencies that we see in transportation, in LNG as well as in pipeline, we may see in the next 5 to 10 years the conventional wisdom of 2,000 kilometers as the break-even distance between pipeline and LNG to be challenged, and it could perhaps well be between, say, 1,200 to 1,500 kilometers. Now, if that happens, then that has serious implications for a region like the East Med. So you will have not only short-run, short-contracted LNG, but you would also have fast-moving, rapidly turning around LNG. And therefore, the dynamics or within the global market, you will see regional dynamics which are quite rapid within their own spheres of influence. So these are some of the ideas that are some of the kinds of discussions I'm having with our clients, with our advisors, with our partners. And I thought I'll just kind of bring some of these macro trends to the table. Power generation, final point, Chairman, I know I'm taking a little bit more time. Power generation has long been considered the mainstay, but really, given the changes in the market design and given the way the various different options for electricity are available, power generation may not remain the mainstay for LNG, at least in the developed markets for Europe in the short term. And therefore, we are looking at transportation, particularly marine transportation, surface transportation, emerging as the two more bigger application areas. It is likely that surface transportation and marine transportation in Europe would emerge to become almost twice as big as today's power generation industry. And to a large extent, that is driven by what happens to the EU policy on transportation. There is a European directive on alternative fuels, which kind of gives option, makes it mandatory for every member state to have one small-scale LNG facility with truck loading and ship loading facilities to be made available. So what that means is that the footprint of the existing regasification terminals might actually change. They might actually have additional jetties or additional infrastructure coming onto them. They usually tend to have this kind of a scope for expansion. So I don't think planning or consents is going to be such a problem. It is perhaps what is going to be a challenge is how quickly the terminaling infrastructure, which is largely infrastructure companies, are able to respond to what is a very dynamic customer-led demand. So it's again a very different dynamic is entering the European LNG industry. So these are some of the few points I would like to kind of cover in the global context. Now, just to kind of speak a little bit more about the East Mediterranean, a lot has been said here, Chairman. We've heard a lot, we've learned a lot. It appears to me that unless that there are a number of resources, and this is a resource-rich region. There is no two ways. Dr. Karbuz's presentation gave us a very clear idea about what this resource base might look like. It perhaps looks like a North Sea, UK North Sea or Norwegian resource base, but fragmented in terms of the entities that are that kind of and contested. So fragmentation and contestation are some of the kind of themes that kind of come to my mind when it kind of making the difference between the North Sea or the East Med. How these disputes are resolved, resource disputes are resolved, is one thing. But if we see the macro trends in global LNG, then unless this market is actually connected to the global LNG market, it would be very difficult for these disputes to themselves get resolved. So rather than kind of going through in a very ideological, geopolitical way, I think if we can come to some pragmatic understanding of what is the price that awaits this resource, I think that might be a far more galvanizing force to bring together a cross-member state collaboration in the East Med region. If that does not happen, I think this is the more interesting part, is that the opportunity cost of not doing so might be quite high, because as more and more volumes are then start to chase essentially a regional market, you will see a significant amount of shareholder value destruction. And when that happens, you are more likely to see conflict than less. So with those few words, I think I will close my remarks and happy to kind of participate in the discussion. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you so much, Ashutosh. Great to have both of your comments. And I think what we can do now is have a free-flowing discussion on some of the topics. Desmond made a very data-heavy presentation. You touched on some of the geopolitical impacts in terms of what you're noticing when it comes to industry contracts. It's an evolving market. It grows bigger by the minute. But I think from a headline perspective, I think it'd be good to start with some of what the data aggregators are telling us. Is that, well, we'll have the Aussies overtaking the Qataris in volume terms.
Yes.
And then over the long-term trends that we are encountering from the data agencies is that the United States might overtake both of them, but yet at the same time the Qataris are stepping up investment. So it is going to be a bit of a fist fight. So how cluttered is the market getting in terms of these three players? Let me start with you, and then I'll come to Desmond.
Well, you have got to understand that the Qatari development was would not have happened without the US support.
That is true. No question about that.
And so now the question before the US suppliers is that, have we created something that, is no longer as helpful to us? Let me put it very straight. That is a more of a conflict brewing. And I do not see therefore a conflict brewing because, both Qatar and US are very savvy traders. They have a very savvy risk management perspective. What we might see is some sort of a swap arrangement developing between the US supply and the delivery point in Qatar, whereby you might actually see some efficiencies in the global LNG market. And we do not know. We have not yet entered that space. But this is, if this is what I call a solution-seeking rather than conflict-seeking idea.
Fair enough. Desmond, in your presentation, you said every molecule has to be delivered. The market dynamic is what it is. From the front row seat that you have at Platts, and you encounter tabulate all the data, what is your reading of the global market?
Well, first of all, I'd like to mention something about what you said regarding the contract models changing, because that is something that we don't have to wait very long to see. So in terms of reference points in the world, right, the contract expiries of your legacy LNG contracts, right? So what I mean is that contracts that were signed 25 years ago are now up for renewal. Here are the countries that are currently going to be renewing these things, right? So you've got Japan and Korea renewing their contracts with Southeast Asia within the next 3 to 5 years. Very broad number because every contract is different, but within that period. So if we're going to see any shift away from a traditional oil contract, that's the period where we see the Asia Pacific begin to say, okay, 25 years, you've amortized the cost of your multi-billion-dollar LNG project. Maybe it's time for me to get a price that is not oil. In Europe, especially the Mediterranean, you're seeing that happening right now because the Spanish contracts with Nigeria and Trinidad and the rest all begin to run out. And either they renew them or they don't renew them. And if they renew them, they're not going to be against your oil percentage anymore, that's for sure. So it's going to be very interesting to see how the Japanese, the Koreans, and the Mediterranean long-term LNG market begins to look at what the next phase of their contracts look like. Because those are the old ones. Now they need an incentive to renegotiate, to sign a new one. Otherwise, Nigeria will lose one of its biggest buyers, right? Trinidad will lose one of its biggest buyers. Indonesia, Malaysia will lose some of their biggest buyers, right? So we don't have long to wait. We just have to find out what happens in those boardrooms, right? Yeah. In terms of other sort of cycles, we're also seeing people. I know I work for Platts and I mention JKM a lot. It's not because I'm trying to sell it, but the fact that people are looking for spot LNG pricing or gas-based LNG pricing down the line, right? You're seeing all those contracts with Tellurian, right, being done against JKM. Traders being willing to do a pricing like that. Vitol, Total also doing contracts against JKM for projects that that are currently being produced. The general forward view, and I would agree with you greatly on this point, the non-contract stuff is definitely going to be very, very different. Insofar as the stuff that's going down the line, from our perspective, is that you're going to have to see a lot of optimizations, because as you mentioned earlier, flexibility and being able to meet the demand for the buyers is very, very important, right? And what kind of prices do the buyers want to see? What kind of mechanisms the buyers want to see? And in terms of the spot trade, we have seen transactions that demand greater flexibility, right? A seller has to offer flex, in Asia at least, flexibility to deliver for that one cargo, delivering to Japan, Korea, China, minimum, right? Otherwise, a portfolio buyer would look at that cargo and go, but what if my position changes? What if one of my end users decides not to take a cargo? I want flexibility to deliver somewhere else. That's the only way you can do it. Same thing for Europe, right? If someone says, I want delivery into Northwest Europe, no one's going to say just the UK. No one's going to say just the Netherlands, right? In fact, a lot of spot purchases in terms of pricing in the Mediterranean have been already sort of gas-based. Turkey is a major spot buyer of LNG in the winter, and a lot of its transactions in the past have either been against a shipping premium to TTF or a shipping premium to MBP, depending on which one is higher, because you have to compete with your nearest market. So none of these are crude prices, right? All of it is spot, and the sellers have to offer the flexibility to go with a floating price, namely a gas index or a assessed index. No fixed price is on its way. It's still around, but some kind of crude number, Brent X.
Sure.
That's not going to be headed that way any longer.
Cool. Ashutosh, we've set the ball rolling. I think there is one hypothesis also doing the round, and of course, you and Desmond agree that the direction of the cargoes is eastwards, and there's copious amounts of U.S. Natural gas coming onto the market. But there is this thing, and I know Desmond said he doesn't like the word glut, but so assuming there is one, a lot of people saying that might curtail investment, and come 2021 and so on, you could then have a reversal of the situation. Is that your reading of it, or are we being a little bit paranoid?
This afternoon I was having a conversation with a friend who's in this room, and I mentioned to him that the LNG business has a history of absorbing the glut fairly quickly.
Right.
And therefore, it really begs the question as to how long will this continue, because either this glut, if this glut lasts 4 or 5 years is what is believed to be, then you're not likely to get the investments, and then the whole 2030 number and the entire projection goes for a 6. I would like to kind of look at the empirical evidence on the ground, and the empirical evidence on the ground in Europe is that coal-fired plants are being switched off. Now, for example, just one Germany announcing, Germany is a large coal-fired plant player, but they have announced their commission on coal, and our analysis suggests that the commission on coal proposals, which talk about a reduction of 3,000 megawatts of plant every year for the next 10-15 years, leads to an incremental gas demand of 13.5 to 15 BCM per year from 2025. So which means that suddenly you might realize in 2025 it was a good thing you did Nord Stream 2. So from a so the point is that we will see these kinds of trends coming through, and the power sector, unless there is a significant change in the power sector, that glut is perhaps not likely to be absorbed, because transportation and industrial applications are not kind of currently the mainstays. So the current mainstay, there has to be a give somewhere, and I do see a number of countries now announcing plans or announcing curtailment of their coal-fired production, and if that happens, the chances are that it is going to be gas and it is going to be LNG, because most of the countries who will possibly think about such curtailments are far away from pipeline sectors. China does not have the kind of pipeline infrastructure for the ambition it has on coal-fired retirements. So there is a discontinuity in some of these key regions, and this discontinuity can help absorb the volumes. So my view is, within a year.
I'll come to small-scale LNG and of course the supply-demand dynamic in a second. But Desmond, what is do you echo the sentiment regarding natural gas, the bridging fuel, and there are plenty of opportunities?
Well, natural gas as a bridging fuel is one thing, but you know what? I'm going to answer that question from a very left field kind of way, because you've got a lot of LNG floating around. It's now comparatively cheap, given historical prices for LNG. And the ability to access LNG is now available to everyone through FSRUs. Now, this is a very strange thing to say, but from the history of pipeline gas negotiations, right, there are at least 2 countries that have been able to get concessions from their Russian gas suppliers as a result of their access to LNG. Now, the times at which they got those concessions to their Russian gas contract, LNG was still relatively expensive. LNG is a lot cheaper now. So if you were looking for a good time to negotiate or renegotiate your gas pipeline supply, which may be based on long-term crude prices or what have you, the very fact that LNG is now essentially a long market gives buyers an opportunity to look at their current gas options and see if LNG is a potential solution for them. The facts speak for themselves. I don't want to get too political, but it worked for the Lithuanians very, very well. In fact, they named their FSRU the Independence, so that kind of gives you a sense of what's going on out there.
No, I'll respond to that very quickly.
I want you to be a little bit political.
Well, you're absolutely right. But it boils down to whether the reopener window is opening in that period or not. What happened in 2009 to 2012, that period, and then 2012 to 2015, is the legacy brotherhood contracts. They all came to the 3 contracts were extended over a period of time, and they all came to a close between 2010 and 2015. So the period of 2012 to 2015 particularly was a period of perfect storm. The legacy contracts had come to an end, the hub liquidity had improved, the bargaining power of buyers particularly in the utility space had improved, and therefore you had the European utilities telling Gazprom that you either meet me at the hub or we are going to trigger a reopener. And what really happened is that essentially, having learned from the 1986 experience, Gazprom decided to go for market share defense as opposed to revenue maximization. So, the fact that they decided to defend their market share meant that they gave away somewhere between 15 and 20% price discounts to their long-term contract prices. And therefore, they were able to retain that market.
It's 23% for Lithuania.
Exactly.
So
But,
what-
so
yeah.
the Lithuanian thing happened 2017, 2018. I'm talking about,
Oh, in the early days.
yeah.
Yeah.
Right. Well, you both brought up Klaipėda and Lithuania as an example. If we are seeing healthy, where possible, where geographically and infrastructurally possible, you see the competition between pipe gas and LNG. Can Turkey take any lessons? Just sort of holistically speaking, examining what we have seen in parts of the world where this is possible, what can the Turks take?
Well, I'll go to the core competency. They are already building they have a shipbuilding infrastructure, and they're building FSRUs, they're building ships. So the technical competence to, build some offshore assets to bring them quickly onto the market is there. The demand is there, and if they are able to do it competitively at prices which are possible in a manufacturing, it's a high quality manufacturing country. What is possible is that the delivered cost or the economics with which they are able to deliver the end user price to the customer can increase. So I would certainly see a scenario where smaller scale LNG. Now the other dimension about small scale LNG is that unlike large scale LNG, the number of process licenses for liquefaction in small scale LNG they are a very different type of companies. So there are about 8 or 10 different options available for liquefaction technologies. So that liquefaction technology, the ability to quickly put together FSRU means that you can actually put together a small, short distance, fast moving LNG chain in a very quick manner. So which means that what really happened in the 25-year time period with large scale LNG could happen with 8 to 10-year contract and small scale liquefaction and regasification. You don't have to do small scale regasification. You can just tap into the underutilized regasification terminal capacity in Europe. So yes, I would say a small scale LNG with a FSRU can help Turkey or a market like Turkey in the East Med to bring gas onto the market very quickly.
Desmond, what does your crystal ball suggest as far as our hosts go?
My solution would be, no surprise, surprise, market-based, right? So one of the interesting things that I noticed in terms of similarity between the domestic importation market for LNG in Turkey is that it's very similar to China about 4 years ago, right? Because in China, the importation ability was held by mostly the state-owned enterprises. So PetroChina, Sinopec, CNOOC, only these guys had access to the LNG markets, and only these guys would be importing LNG without a proper pricing mechanism downstream for essentially for PetroChina to make its money back, right? Because they bought it for security of supply reasons and were barely making money if they were making money at all, right? And there was no view on a competitive price for what LNG is worth in China. Delivered at the terminal, that's a different price. Domestically, that's a different price. Because the value of it changes. Now, what's happening in China is that you have the Shanghai Petroleum Exchange, right? You have a traded price on the exchange for trucked LNG, so LNG in small parcels, small scale for trucked. You have a traded price for natural gas at various locations in China. So that way, you have the ability of that own market to not only decide what the domestic market price is through an exchange or through competitive pricing on their own, but then they also have, and here's the market-based solution, third-party access to the terminals in China, meaning smaller buyers, power producers, gas distributors in China can utilize these terminals, buy LNG from the international market, which may be at a more competitive price than the domestic price because of supply-demand situations. Utilize that, and then not only do you add more liquidity and prove more value for the delivered cargo market, so the big cargo market, you also add flexibility and diversity downstream. Turkey is at the state-owned sort of, in fact, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, there are only 2 players who can bring LNG into the terminals in Turkey. I think it's just
Yes,
BOTAŞ and
they can.
Egegas.
They can get
That is correct.
So, there have been, of course, announced plans for greater third-party participation at the terminals. And I think greater third-party participation at the terminals will increase the turnover of gas flow through the terminals, generating a value for it domestically, and generating a value that can be shown to the international markets to say, look, my domestic market looks like this. I can really only pay that, unless, of course, there's a competing market next door that will pay more or something. So if there's a sudden heat wave in Spain, everything is dry, then you'll have to outbid Spain. Or if it suddenly gets very cold in Japan, you have to outbid Japan on a global basis, of course. But if you want a reference price, you'll need more people participating in that market. And the only way you can do that, and how it developed in other countries, I'm not saying it's the solution. I'm saying there's a similar evolutionary process out there that can be observed.
Yes.
And that's what happened in China. Third-party access really opened up that market.
Ashutosh, we're talking about an evolutionary axis, and that Desmond brings up the example of China, and we all remember the Chinese-Russian deal for natural gas, the terms of which were, at least officially, never released. So the Chinese are also playing this game of pipe gas versus LNG.
For sure.
So they should. But more holistically speaking, is it, and we had this discussion about, vis-a-vis the relatively low oil price climate in other sessions yesterday, it begs to ask the question, are we in a buyer's market? It always comes up at one of your events, but for the benefit of all of us here, I mean, what's your reading? Do you think it's becoming a buyer's market?
It is increasingly becoming a buyer's market. It is increasing. I will give you an example though. In India, for example, there is the Kochi terminal. It has been well established for a very long time, but the pipeline to the main demand centers, about 300, 400 kilometers hinterland, has not been developed. Now, the customers are there saying, we would love to use LNG because the delivered price at which we are actually paying for diesel, imported LNG is actually competitive for us. The marketer for LNG in India was the state-owned company. And, the discussion went something like this, saying, look, this is what I'm making, this is what is my end product price, so this is the price that I can afford for my gas. Can you deliver, if you can deliver me a price for gas in this price window, I will be very happy to switch from my diesel supply. I said, you don't know how LNG pricing works, you don't know how LNG markets work, we don't sell LNG like that, we can't sell to you. So, this is, very unimaginative, because they just took the buyer for granted that, what would the buyer know? If we don't tell them how the gas is sold, how would the buyer know? But then the buyers are saying, look, we've read about this market, we kind of started to study this market because we are serious about it. And, we are looking for someone who will enable us a solution. So again, this is not about the traded market, but this is about creating the market and creating the solution, saying, is there someone who can actually, is there a company that can provide us the LNG trucks, and can we use the LNG trucks to mimic a pipeline or a supply chain? Can we as an industrial estate, dedicate, cooperate and, create some part of our industrial estate, convert it into tank storage for LNG, where, we can offer it to this partner? So there are these kinds of business models which are coming in, and what has I will always say, what happens in the retail, consumer goods market also can happen in the energy market. Right. Miniaturized, packetized LNG for specific industrial estates, for specific centers of consumption, can actually unleash a very large market.
Let me continue on that theme, because if you look at the transportation sector, you obviously see public transportation in a lot of countries. They're making more of a move towards electric. But if you look at specifically on haulage fleets, your shipping haulage companies, they are seriously examining LNG. And of course, in Turkey's near neighborhood in Central and Eastern Europe, there are quite a few moves ahead. I mean, I visited a project in Austria looking at LNG for fleet transportation. So would that create an additional demand center, especially when you were talking about oversupply?
It's hard to say because at the moment, if you do the math, right? Let me just put it this way: demand centers are one thing, but we also have to keep this in perspective. Your average, so haulage is just a tank on a truck, right? So I'm just going to go one step bigger and say LNG on a ship, bunker fuel, right? One LNG bunker barge holds only about like the largest of these bunker barges is 10,000 million cubic meters, right?
10,000 cubic meters.
Yeah. Oh, sorry, 10,000, well, not million, 10,000 cubic meters. 10,000 cubic meters. How much is held on an LNG tanker? On average, 165,000 cubic meters. Yes. So you want demand, you've got it, but it's really small. And I'm not an expert on LNG as transportation, but I've been looking at the bunker fuel side, and I've been looking at the that versus the large cargo side. And while people can say if the world changed all of its vehicles to LNG or hydrogen or something, those numbers look massive, right? But how right here, right now, in this oversupply situation, how much can that take out of the system?
Yeah.
Not that much.
It's good, but we're a long way from that world.
Yes, it could, but we're a long way from that world.
Let me switch tack. I'm conscious of time. Let me switch tack. I think we briefly discussed small-scale LNG, but there's some developments afoot, I beg your pardon, in the United States on this small-scale LNG front. And of course, your Platt's colleagues in Houston have covered it variously. The moves afoot in the U.S. Senate, etc. About U.S. small-scale LNG. It's in the very nascent stages. But could it add another dimension to the overall supply dynamic, Ashutosh?
The small-scale LNG side actually did start in the U.S.
No, yes,
and they have on land liquefaction plants which kind of connect to pipeline systems, they liquefy, store, and there is a local ecosystem there. I guess it may continue.
I'm referring to the latest moves afoot in the Senate, which make America great again.
Okay. Now to that extent, I think it has to be said that
make LNG great again.
They've already done that. They've already done that. And if you look at the emissions record or the CO2 performance of the U.S. electricity sector, then I think Mr. Trump would have a point. That he said, this whole climate negotiations are a waste of time. Look what I did in 10 years. I changed the carbon footprint in America. It is true.
We're already talking about incremental American volumes. If they're going so gung-ho about it, then how's the sort of medium term looking?
Well, here's the interesting thing that you want to take into account with the U.S. So. Initially, with all of the U.S. projects, a lot of people were saying, look, Henry Hub is so cheap, it's $3. These days, Henry Hub gas in the U.S. for indexation is about $2.70, $2.55, thereabouts. Very, very, very affordable. Why is that? Well, one of the things that I like to look at for how U.S. gas and and subsequently U.S. LNG fit into the picture is, strangely enough, back around the other way, how is the oil market doing? Because U.S. natural gas production is not profitable. You make money off the liquids, you make money off the shale oil. The reason why there's so much gas is they're drilling for a heck of a lot of oil. And that, for as long as the U.S. policy is to counterbalance other markets in the world by providing additional supply into global crude markets. So as long as that works, you're going to continue to get sustained LNG production. So weirdly enough, the higher oil prices get, the cheaper gas prices will get in the U.S. Because you produce more oil, that gas needs to go into the system. That gas may or may not be turned into LNG in that respect, right? So the way I would see it, in a very weird, circuitous way, the U.S. oversupply is driven by its very affordable cost. If oil were suddenly to become, I don't know, $40 per barrel or something, I'm not really sure what the threshold is because it depends per project. then you're going to see Henry Hub rise, and then people will start nominating less US LNG. But for now, as long as US LNG is very, very affordable, and now, these days, willing to sign contracts in a variety of more flexible contract structures and pricing, you're going to see that kind of production being very much favored by most markets. Sure. The only downside to that, of course, is that in the long term, it puts downward pressure unless there's some kind of demand to absorb it all. And it's not going to be LNG as a bunker fuel, too small. It's not going to be road trucking in the medium term. It's going to have to, at the end of the day, surplus LNG is always going to be absorbed by your end user at a price that suits their situation, right? Because there's always going to be a price for everything. If you offer a guy a cargo cheap enough, he'll flush his current tanks, take your cargo and make the margin between the previous cargo and his current cargo. There's always a price for acceptability, but in terms of demand growth, that's a different story. You can always find a home because it has to find a home. It's just a question of how much you're willing to pay for it.
Ashutosh, last month I did the whole drive between Morgantown, West Virginia to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And there, as you know, Desmond touched on the Henry Hub price. There are a whole lot of people there spooked that they might see sub-$2 Henry Hub prices, right? And then you're very well networked in DC. You've got loads of these projects, these export terminal projects, awaiting FERC approval, but that doesn't mean they'll see light of day.
No.
So how complicated is the situation?
Well, this is complicated because, as Desmond was also saying, why do US producers continue to, the death of the US shale industry has been projected and
for years.
Over years.
What
it does not take into consideration is two things. One is that there are certain covenants on the land as a result of which you need to keep on drilling. So in order to keep your license, you have to keep drilling. Therefore, you take a hit on the gas price if you take the hit on the gas price. But you kind of make it up on the oil and the liquids.
Right.
The second is that there has been a consolidation within the US shale play. And there has been a lot of activity where the search for efficiency still continues. So if you look at the reported lost time incidents for US shale 2009 to the reported lost time incidents US shale 2018, right, you will see a significant drop, and that is not because they have improved performance dramatically, it's just that new players have got into it. The experimenters who the pioneers of the 2006 to 2008 have been taken over by mega companies or established companies who have brought in their health and safety systems onto it. So there is a whole lot of that performance culture which has changed in the US. So I think that will continue, and I have a belief in the US ability of innovation, that whatever is thrown at them, they'll always try and make it work. And this low price environment, I think they will figure it out. They'll probably figure it out by building infrastructure, by financing new infrastructure, growing their domestic market. So
I think the I word is key, not just for the Americans. The Aussies have promised a fair amount of innovation, and Qatar famously left OPEC,
yes,
saying we've got to double down, concentrate our efforts on our core competency, which is LNG.
Yeah.
Gentlemen, I'm conscious of time. I think at this point it'd be worth to ask you both to give your closing statements, but we'll do it in reverse order. We'll put Ashutosh on the spot first. So Ashutosh, your reading of both what we've discussed over the last sort of an hour and a half, and of course your observations of the summit is concluding. So your observations for the last 2 days, actually.
Well, I think for the last 2 days, what we've seen is a lot of information come our way in terms of what is going on in this part of the world. It's always a pleasure to come here every year to learn a little bit more, but the story keeps on changing. And again, the timing for this session has been propitious. We've heard the minister speak about the 2 drill ships. I see in the next couple of years an element of drill boat diplomacy in the region, for sure. But I also am quite confident somehow that the forces of market and the commercial pragmatism, because what is now available at stake is a non-trivial prize. will perhaps force minds to think about ways of innovatively collaborating with each other. So I am actually an optimist that I see more collaboration in the East Med region emerging. We will see. I mean, tomorrow or this week, IGU will be publishing its report on gas, and they have written a case study on Greece as a center for LNG bunkering in southeastern Europe. But look at which is the biggest market in southeastern Europe. It is this market.
That's where we are.
So commercial pragmatism, I think, will trump geopolitics.
All right. Desmond, do you see commercial pragmatism trumping geopolitics?
I'm not sure if I don't want to look at it as from the perspective of commercial pragmatism over geopolitics. I would say there is an opportunity, given price convergence, right, where volume stays within the region. You're not competing with that many people anymore, and there's quite a bit of volume around, right? And what that tends to breed is opportunities for attempting to try all of the stuff that the market has been talking about regarding LNG for a lot less. You couldn't convince somebody to compete against a Japanese price for LNG for bunker in 2013 when it was, just under 20 bucks per MMBTU. Now it's $5 per MMBTU in winter. So go figure, right? The way I would see it is that there's so many bits and pieces, especially in the Eastern Mediterranean, and actually the Mediterranean in general, actually, where the long market for available LNG has created a pricing environment that allows for experimentation. So everyone was talking about, let's do LNG as a bunker fuel in the Med, in Gibraltar, and or to help supply the traffic in the Bosphorus. LNG is now cheap enough to do that. I'm not saying it's risk-free, but the price of the commodity helps, right? So if the world ever wanted to try something wacky with LNG, the price at the moment is quite suitable for that.
Would allow you to do that.
It'll allow you to do that, because everyone already has the infrastructure, everyone already has the access.
Absolutely.
But everyone never had the material, or rather, never had the right price with the material to try it out with. But now you do.
Sure. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for your insights. And on that note, ladies and gentlemen, I bring this session to a close. It's been a pleasure having your company, and thanks to Ashutosh and Desmond for their valuable insight.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Good evening.
Thank you.